What follows is a brief construction montage. Flashback. End of flashback. Soon after montage. Yesterday. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. A few moments later. More moments later. Later, in the void. A little later, much later, much later, much later, the following Thursday, later that same evening, just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours 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 later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later, many unbearable hours later, tomorrow for sure, 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next day, the next day, the next day, the following day, tomorrow, the very next evening, day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, several days later, 1 week later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 6 months later, several months later, many months later, 70 years later, 75 years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, 1 eternity later. So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab opening night, a lot of boring math later. Many tic-tacs later. One semester later. One debt to society later. One frozen wasteland later. One long angry line later. One shift later. One extremely annoying shift later. One wiener later. One pair of pants later. 82 kilometers later. 298 frozen patties later. Thousands of tears later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. A few inches later, eventually, several bad puns later. Graduation day. Epilogue. Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.